A sudden knock echoed through the quiet of Baker Street, the kind that stirs the air with unspoken urgency. A young woman, trembling and veiled in secrecy, arrived with a story half-spoken and a brooch that could unravel a family's past. But when a brutal murder is discovered, the threads of her visit tangle with an ancient grudge and an aristocratic betrayal that won't stay buried. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on one of those damp and grey mornings peculiar to early March in London that I found myself once again at Baker Street, observing Holmes in one of his familiar moods, aloof, contemplative, and altogether unreadable to the casual eye. I had scarcely removed my overcoat when he looked up from his armchair with that curious gleam in his eye that signalled an observation was soon to follow. "You have recently returned from Marylebone Station," he remarked, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "The man who brushed against you there is employed in upholstery, older, left-handed, with a child in need of school fees." I could not help but blink in astonishment. "Upon my word, Holmes, that is astonishing, even for you." He gestured lightly toward my left sleeve, where a single strand of vivid green wool clung stubbornly to the fabric. "The colour and weave," he continued, "belong unmistakably to the upholstery lining of the Northwood omnibuses. The frayed ends suggest it came not from seating, but from a repair apron, a short one, by its height. The rest you may deduce, Watson, if you would only observe." It was in moments like these that Holmes's genius reminded me just how vast the chasm between his mind and mine truly was. Yet before I could inquire further, a sudden knock at the door interrupted our exchange, a hesitant, almost frightened sound that would soon introduce us to a mystery far deeper than green wool or railway platforms. Mrs. Hudson entered with a look of mild alarm, announcing that a young lady wished to speak with Mr. Holmes, privately, if it might be arranged. Holmes nodded, and within moments, the drawing-room door opened to admit a woman not much older than 20, cloaked in a deep emerald travelling coat and wearing upon her head a green felt hat with a narrow feather curling across the brim. She paused just inside the threshold, her eyes flickering about the room before settling upon Holmes. Though composed in posture, her hands trembled visibly as she removed her gloves, and there was something about the fixed serenity of her expression that suggested it had been hard won. "Pray, do sit down," Holmes said gently, indicating the chair across from him. "You are safe here, Miss—" She hesitated, then offered the faintest of smiles. I'd rather not give my name, Mr. Holmes. Forgive me." "As you wish," he replied without resistance, though I could see from the narrowing of his eyes that the omission troubled him. "I need only to know," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "if the past can ever be kept buried, if a name erased by scandal may truly stay dead." Before Holmes could respond, she rose with sudden urgency. "Forgive me. I should not have come." And with that, she turned and left the room as swiftly as she had entered, the faint scent of lavender clinging in her wake, and a far heavier tension left behind. It was several long seconds after the door had closed before either of us moved. Then Holmes stood abruptly and strode across the carpet, eyes fixed on the armrest of the chair where our visitor had sat. Nestled within the crease of the velvet cushion was a small object, glinting faintly in the half-light. "Aha," he murmured, lifting it carefully between thumb and forefinger. "And so the lady leaves us with a gift." I rose to inspect it beside him. It was a brooch, delicate, elliptical, and unmistakably old. The central design was a silver sparrow in flight, wings outstretched, its eye formed from a tiny but genuine opal. Around its edge ran an inscription in Latin, partly worn, "Silentium fallet." Silence deceives. It is no common trinket, Holmes observed, holding it to the light. Edwardian at the earliest, perhaps earlier still. The clasp has been resoldered and poorly. And the design? I asked. He nodded. Symbolic, intentionally so. This sparrow was chosen, not inherited. It speaks of secrets and of flight, of something guarded and perhaps escaped. Do you suppose she left it behind deliberately? I asked. Holmes turned the brooch slowly in his fingers. I am never one to believe in coincidence, Watson, he replied. And yet the brooch was lodged so deeply in the cushion that I doubt even she noticed its absence. No, I believe this was truly accidental, and therein lies its value. A mask may conceal a face, but a forgotten token tells all. We sat in silence once more, the unanswered questions gathering like storm clouds above us. A nameless girl, a brooch bearing the emblem of a bird in flight, and a singular green hat, its meaning still to be revealed. It was scarcely the following morning when Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, with his usual briskness and pallor that hinted at unrest. Holmes, who had spent the early part of the day quietly observing the brooch under varying magnifications, raised his gaze but did not rise. There's been a murder, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade began without preamble, brushing a damp sheen from his coat sleeves as he took the seat opposite. A young maid, strangled, found this morning in a long-abandoned townhouse in Bloomsbury. Holmes tapped the rim of his teacup thoughtfully. A maid, you say? What brings you to me? Surely Scotland Yard is capable of managing domestic tragedies. Lestrade's expression darkened. It's not the girl herself, but the setting that's troubling. The place has been locked up for years. No electricity, no signs of life. And yet someone brought her there carefully. No struggle. No valuables missing. Just a corpse left in silence, Holmes supplied, his voice low. Yes, with her face turned to the hearth and her hands folded, as though placed there deliberately. Holmes glanced toward the side table where the green brooch lay beneath a linen cloth. And the cause? Manual strangulation. Ligature marks on the neck. Likely someone she knew or trusted. I felt a familiar chill move across me. There was always something particularly vile about murders committed in silence, without the chaos of forced entry or the din of panic. A quiet death suggested intent, intimacy, control. Anything unusual found at the scene? Holmes asked, almost idly. Lestrade nodded slowly. Yes, a feather, green, delicate. It caught in a floorboard beside the body. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Then we may perhaps have met our phantom after all. And so, with that grim proclamation, the veil began to lift. Holmes leaned forward with a sudden intensity that I knew well. The green feather had clearly struck a chord. Describe it to me, he said. Lestrade reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, from which he produced the item in question. Holmes took it delicately, holding it by its quill and tilting it beneath the gaslight. It was narrow, fine, and of an unmistakably vibrant green, a colour rarely found outside of certain exotic birds or particular ladies' fashion. Quite rare, Holmes murmured. You have more? Lestrade, encouraged by Holmes's interest, produced a small notebook. One witness, he said, a charwoman from across the street, claims she saw a young woman leaving the building in the early hours, dark hair, slim build, wearing a green hat with a long feather. Holmes nodded without surprise. She said the girl was glancing over her shoulder as though afraid. Didn't see the face clearly, but the feather stood out in the lamplight. I could not help but recall the young woman who had visited us the day before, her expression taut with restraint, her voice brittle with buried tension. Holmes handed the feather back. And no sign of forced entry? None. Door was unlocked when the landlord came by to inspect a burst pipe. The maid's body was found upstairs, fully clothed, no purse, nothing in her pockets. Holmes steepled his fingers. And you believe this girl in the green hat may have played a part? Lestrade hesitated. It's not just the feather. It's the atmosphere, Holmes. Whoever brought her there wanted her to be found, as if it were staged. Indeed, Holmes replied. Then let us suppose for now that the girl in green was not the murderer, but the key to unlocking the one who is. As soon as Lestrade departed, Holmes stood and moved to the mantel with a kind of restless purpose I had come to associate with moments of inner certainty. He picked up the brooch once more and held it beside the feather. Watson, do you recall the woman who visited us yesterday? The trembling fingers, the hat? Of course, I replied. She wore green, precisely that shade. Holmes gave a short nod. And this feather, identical in colour and curvature, belonged to her hat. There is little doubt. You believe she was involved in the murder? I believe, Holmes replied, that she is trying very hard to distance herself from it. But she has failed. He moved to his writing desk and retrieved a slender volume from one of the lower drawers. It was filled with fashion sketches and advertisements, ladies' millinery from the prior season. I had seen something similar, he explained. A hat of that particular style was produced only by a small atelier on King's Row. Miss Adeline Frobisher's designs. She is known for embellishments of exotic plumage. There were fewer than a dozen hats made with these feathers. And you think she may know the wearer? I think, Holmes said gravely, that she will confirm what we already suspect. Our visitor is the same girl seen near the scene of the murder. The pieces, it seemed, were no longer scattered. Holmes, ever methodical, was beginning to align them. But what disturbed me most was not the possibility of the young woman's guilt, but the air of desperation she had worn like a veil, something born not of violence committed, but of danger still drawing near. Holmes had laid the brooch on a sheet of white paper, outlining its details with almost surgical care. With a magnifying glass and his usual precision, he examined the inscription once more. Silentium fallit. Silence deceives. That motto is not merely poetic, he said. It is heraldic. He rose and crossed to a leather-bound directory near the bookshelf. It was a compendium of noble family crests and their respective mottos, a volume Holmes often used in cases involving lineage and aristocratic scandal. Here, he said at last, tapping the page, the Greywood family, once a fixture of London society. Their title dissolved some 10 years ago, following a rather severe financial disgrace and rumours of internal betrayal. Do you believe the brooch belongs to them? It is certain, Holmes replied. The sparrow was their symbol, always in flight, never nesting. A metaphor for ambition, some said. Others called it cowardice. And the woman? She is either a Greywood or tied to them by blood or grievance. Holmes looked again at the brooch, his eyes narrowing. It is a symbol of allegiance or memory. Either way, it was not worn lightly. What does this mean for the case? Holmes's expression turned grim. It means, my dear Watson, that we are not dealing with a petty crime of passion, nor with an isolated tragedy. The girl in the green hat belongs to a story buried deep within the faded grandeur of a ruined name. And such stories, he added, almost to himself, rarely end without consequence. The wind rattled softly against the windows, as though the past itself had stirred, and I, for one, felt the beginning of something far darker than we had yet glimpsed. We journeyed that afternoon to the derelict townhouse in Bloomsbury, a structure long past its prime, its boarded windows and soot-darkened facade, standing like a mausoleum among the modern facades that surrounded it. The key to the place had been turned over to Lestrade by the landlord, and Holmes, as always, insisted upon visiting the scene before any detail might be disturbed. Inside, a deathly stillness reigned. Dust lay thick on the wooden floorboards, disturbed only by a few booted impressions and a scattering of ash from the hearth. The air was close, heavy with disuse, and the faint, sickly scent of old fabric and decay. Holmes moved silently from room to room, his eyes flitting from ceiling to carpet, fingers trailing lightly along the edges of doors and window panes. "This place has not known company in years," I observed quietly. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, crouching near the wall, "which makes the presence of death all the more conspicuous." We were led to the upstairs chamber where the maid had been found. Though the body had been removed, the tragic imprint of her final repose remained. A faint outline in the dust, an impression in the worn rug, the small twist of carpet where her foot must have shifted in death. Holmes crouched once again, examining the boards near the hearth. She was placed here deliberately. And yet, this is not the true theatre of crime. It is a stage. "A stage," I repeated. Holmes glanced at me, the ghost of a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Indeed, and we have only just arrived in the wings." He leaned forward, peering beneath the hearth, and his expression sharpened. "Watson, bring me the lantern, if you please." With the lantern's flickering glow cast low, Holmes ran his fingers across the soot-blackened edge of the hearth. There, beneath the iron grate and partially obscured by years of grime, were faint scratches in the wood, deliberate, narrow, and repeated in regular intervals. "Someone has pried at this before," he said. "Not recently, but not so long ago as to be forgotten by time either. Note how the dust settles unevenly. This panel has been removed." I crouched beside him, peering at the aged floorboards. Indeed, upon closer inspection, I could make out the fine, almost imperceptible groove of a concealed seam. Holmes took a thin blade from his coat and inserted it gently into the joint. With a careful press, the panel gave way, revealing a shallow cavity beneath the floor. Resting inside was a small parcel, wrapped in oilskin and bound with twine, now brittle with age. Holmes opened it with great care, and from within withdrew a slim, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and dry with time. "A ledger," he murmured. "No title, no markings." He opened it to a page in the centre. It was filled with ink entries, dates, initials, and lines of obscure Latin phrases, interspersed with what appeared to be amounts in pounds and guineas. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes did not reply at once. He turned several pages in silence, his eyes narrowing. "I make of it," he said at last, "that someone feared this book would be found, and took every precaution to ensure it would not." He closed it with deliberation and rose. "We are now dealing not merely with murder, Watson, but with secrets someone once paid dearly to keep buried." Holmes laid the ledger across a makeshift writing surface and began examining its entries with fastidious care. The ink had faded in places, but enough remained legible for him to piece together fragments of meaning. "It is a financial register of sorts," he explained, "but not for ordinary commerce. These initials, PL, J, G, E, W, recur with regularity, always beside rounded sums and phrases in Latin. See here, audatem fortuna juvat, fortune favours the bold, and again, pecunia non olet, money does not stink." The language of Roman vice, Watson, not virtue. I leaned in to study a series of dates circled in red. 3 specific days over the span of 5 years, each associated with multiple names and considerably larger sums than the rest. "What do you suppose these mean?" I asked. Holmes tapped one of the entries. "I suspect they mark events, gatherings perhaps, possibly wagers." "Gambling?" "Something like it," he replied, "but with stakes far beyond the gaming table. Look at the final page. It has been torn away, but not carelessly. Someone meant to remove a name. He held the book up to the light and tilted the torn edge. Note the pressure marks. A heavier hand. Emotional, perhaps. Panicked. The writer feared exposure. There was a silence between us as the implications began to settle. This ledger was not merely a financial document. It was a record of complicity, of debts not merely fiscal, but moral. Who would keep such a book hidden in a place like this? I murmured. Holmes closed the cover and stood. Someone who knew that hiding the past in darkness was easier than atoning for it in daylight. And with that, we descended the stairs once more, ledger in hand and questions multiplying. It was only upon returning to Baker Street that Holmes, after a brief meal and an hour of solitary study, pronounced the phrase aloud. "The Sparrowhawk Society." He said it quietly, almost as though testing its weight in the air. I looked up from the ledger, where I'd been attempting to make sense of the symbols and initials. "What is it?" "An aristocratic enclave," Holmes explained. "Founded some 2 decades past by a coterie of young nobles and industrial heirs. Ostensibly a private club for discussion of politics and philosophy, but in truth, a clandestine network for high-stakes gambling, influence peddling, and strategic ruin." "How do you know of it?" "I was consulted, briefly, by a clerk in the House of Lords who believed his superior was being blackmailed. The society collapsed not long after amid rumours of forged inheritances and a suicide hushed by noble privilege." "And this ledger?" Holmes nodded. "A relic of that decay. An account book kept by one who feared he would become the next sacrifice to the cause." I stared at the sparrow embossed faintly on the back cover, wings outstretched. Holmes folded his hands. Someone sought to bring that bird to flight again, and someone else was murdered to keep it grounded. By the following morning, Holmes had identified a common thread in several names from the ledger. One in particular stood out: Greywood. With that confirmation, we made our way to the edge of Hampstead Heath, where the Greywood estate once held prominence among London's most reputable manors. The house we approached was still impressive in its architecture, but weathered by time and circumstance. Cracked masonry, moss-covered balustrades, and unkempt hedges spoke of a lineage left to rot quietly behind closed curtains. A footman, thin and ashen, received us and led us through a long corridor to a sombre parlour where Sir Lionel Greywood awaited. He was a man of wan complexion and prematurely stooped frame, his bearing diminished by age or shame, though not without an attempt at dignity. "I assume this is about Clara," he said without greeting, his voice dry as parchment. "Your daughter is safe," Holmes replied, "but her name has been connected to an event of a serious nature." Greywood closed his eyes for a moment. "She bears a name that is no longer shield, but burden." Holmes studied the man intently. "Were you a member of the Sparrowhawk Society, Sir Lionel?" There was a pause, pregnant, deliberate. "I was," he said at last. "We all were once." Outside, the wind stirred the branches like fingers through secrets not yet spoken. We were shortly introduced to Clara Greywood, who entered the parlour with measured grace and an expression I recognised at once from our previous encounter: serenity cloaking dread. Her green hat, so striking in design, rested in her hands. Holmes stood as she entered, his manner courteous but keenly observant. "You've changed your hat, Miss Greywood," he remarked gently. She hesitated, then looked down at the object in her hands. "This is my only one." Holmes nodded, as if he accepted the answer. "You visited Baker Street 2 days ago. Do you deny it?" "I do," she replied calmly. "I've been unwell. I've not left the house." Her gaze met Holmes's squarely. There was no trembling, no stammer, only a quiet firmness, as though she had rehearsed the denial. Holmes turned to me, as if to say the matter was concluded. But I saw the faintest flicker of disappointment cross his face. He knew she was lying, and she knew that he knew. But she would not say more. Outside, the manor's decay whispered through the cracks, and I could not help but feel that Clara's silence bore more weight than any confession could have done. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, a telegram awaited us on the side table, Lestrade's crisp script reporting the arrest of a petty thief named Joseph Pike. The man had been found in a pawnshop attempting to sell a necklace identified as belonging to the murdered maid. Holmes read it without comment and handed it to me. "Well?" I asked. "Could this be our man?" Holmes sat, steepling his fingers. "Too convenient," he murmured. "Too timely, and far too simple. But he had the necklace. A necklace which may well have been taken after the fact, or planted upon him altogether." He rose and paced the room. A murder built on legacy, silence, and symbolic warning is not the work of a street urchin in search of coin. I watched him, silent in my agreement. Holmes turned to the window, peering into the fog beyond. "No, Watson," he said at last. "Our murderer walks among polished floors and oil paintings. And the real question is not how he or she killed, but why." And with that, we stood on the threshold of something far deeper than theft or passion, a secret gilded with guilt and held in place by blood. It was with a silent, growing disquiet that I observed Clara Greywood in the waning hours of our visit. While Holmes engaged her father in polite but incisive inquiries, I turned my attention to the young woman whose presence lingered like a question never fully spoken. She sat near the window, her posture composed yet stiff, hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles whitened. There was something haunted in her manner, as though she existed within a world I could not see, one shaped not by the room around her, but by memories and expectations pressing in from without. Her responses, when given, were precise and well considered. Yet it was not what she said that gave me pause. It was what she withheld. Her silences felt deliberate, sculpted, as though crafted not to deceive but to protect. When Holmes addressed her again, asking gently about the brooch, her voice trembled just once before she steadied it. "I have no recollection of it. Perhaps it belonged to one of the housemaids." "Perhaps," Holmes echoed, though I sensed he found her reply as unsatisfying as I did. Later, as we made our way down the overgrown path from the manor, I ventured to speak what I had withheld. "She is frightened, Holmes," I said. "But not of you, not even of the law." Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, she is afraid of what may come if truth is allowed to surface, and I fear—" He paused, glancing behind him toward the house. "That the truth lies not in what she has done, but in what has been done to her." In Clara's eyes, I had seen the shadow not of guilt, but of inherited sorrow. The following evening, as Holmes sat reviewing the ledger and various annotations he had begun compiling from it, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a small envelope that had arrived by post. There was no return address, only our residence inscribed in a hand that struck me at once as peculiar. Fluid, yes, but bearing the uneven weight of uncertainty or haste. Holmes opened it wordlessly. Inside was a single slip of parchment upon which had been penned a solitary line in ink that had only just dried. "Leave the past buried, or suffer its exhumation." There was no signature. He turned the note over in his hand, then held it up to the light. No watermark, no identifying features. The paper was coarse but thick, parchment of a kind used by private legal clerks, or those in the habit of preserving anonymity. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "You're being warned off," I said. He offered a faint smile. "It appears so, and quite clumsily at that. Whoever penned this is not accustomed to threats, but has lately found occasion to make one. You'll disregard it, I assume. Holmes tucked the note into the ledger. I never walk away from the scent of buried things, Watson, especially when someone else fears the digging. Though he returned to his work with apparent calm, I noted his fingers tapped more frequently upon the edge of the table, a sign in Holmes that the game had grown personal. It was the following morning when a telegram arrived, this time from the Greywood estate. Its wording was urgent and unembellished. Miss Clara Greywood has disappeared. No note, no trace. Police notified. Kindly advise. Holmes read it thrice before rising with swift purpose. Watson, he said, our fragile Miss Greywood has been plucked from the board, or removed herself of her own accord. In either case, the game changes. Within the hour, we returned to Hampstead. The house was in an uproar. Servants spoke in hushed tones. Sir Lionel sat hunched and pale, a decanter half drained at his side. The green hat still rested in the parlour where Clara had last left it. She was here last night, the housekeeper insisted. She read for a time. Then we heard nothing. No struggle, Holmes asked. None. Her room was undisturbed. Holmes ascended to Clara's chamber and spent a long while within. When he rejoined me, his expression was grave. Her wardrobe is intact, but the maid's drawer has been rifled. You believe she was taken? I believe, he said slowly, that Clara Greywood was manipulated, either by threat, by shame, or by a promise tied to the past. And where does that lead us? Holmes's eyes darkened. To the roots of the Sparrowhawk Society, and to the final act of a revenge long in gestation. Clara's absence spoke louder than her presence ever had, and I could not shake the feeling that we had allowed a soul in peril to vanish while still under our gaze. Holmes, as ever, turned to knowledge before conjecture. That afternoon, we paid a discreet visit to a former associate of his, Mr. Giles Merrow, a retired antiquarian whose once renowned curiosity cabinet had been replaced by a modest library and failing eyesight. The Sparrowhawk Society, he mused when Holmes introduced the subject. Yes, I recall. 1878, I believe. A scandal buried by 3 titled families and a very reluctant bishop. He rifled through a dusty folder and extracted a faded article clipped from the Times. No names mentioned, but the implication of suicide, forgery, and a sisterhood betrayed. The society began as a gentleman's club, Merrow continued, but grew into something darker. Wagers on scandal, manipulations of inheritance, even whispered rituals. All quite distasteful. A woman, Lady Emmeline Greywood, was said to have exposed them before she... He trailed off. Before she ended her life, Holmes supplied gently. Merrow inclined his head. Yes, she leapt from the library tower. Her journals vanished. Her name faded. As we departed, Holmes turned to me with an expression I seldom saw, one marked by something near sorrow. It appears, Watson, that Clara Greywood bears not only a name, but a mother's unfinished war. Later that evening, Holmes said little as we returned to Baker Street. Only when we sat again by the fire did he finally speak. Clara Greywood is not merely a victim of present circumstance, he said. She is the daughter of Lady Emmeline Greywood, the very woman who dared to speak truth against the Sparrowhawk Society, and she has been made to pay that price. You believe her disappearance is retribution? Holmes shook his head slowly. No, retaliation is rarely so delayed. This is resurrection. Someone is resurrecting the old order, and Clara stands either as a pawn or a final act of penance. And the maid who died? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Used, sacrificed, possibly for silence, or as warning. He stood and retrieved the brooch from the drawer, holding it in the firelight. The silver sparrow gleamed faintly, wings forever poised in motion. Lady Emmeline left behind no journal, no confession. But her daughter wears the same green hat and walks the same path of secrets. He turned to me then, his voice low. If Clara is not found soon, Watson, I fear the sparrowhawk will have claimed its final prize. And so, the legacy of a mother's truth had become the inheritance of a daughter's peril. It was in the early hours of a rain-swept morning that another telegram shattered what little calm remained. Its terse phrasing offered no comfort. Sir Lionel Greywood, gravely injured in study. Physicians summoned. Entry forced. Request your presence immediately. Holmes wasted no time. By noon, we had arrived once more at the brooding Greywood estate, where a servant, white-faced and trembling, led us past a gaggle of whispering household staff to the dim study where Sir Lionel had been found. He lay upon a chaise, blood seeping through the bandage wound about his temple. A heavy brass inkwell, now shattered, had been the apparent weapon. Though semi-conscious, he offered no explanation, only muttered fragments. It was her, the green, the eyes, before descending into silence again. The room bore signs of disorder, papers scattered, a chair overturned, the curtains drawn hastily aside. Most telling of all, however, was the atmosphere, thick not merely with shock, but with something more insidious: fear, guilt, concealment. Holmes stood in contemplative silence, his eyes flitting from wall to floor to ceiling. An act of violence wrapped in theatre, he murmured. But for whom was the performance intended? There was no need to answer, for if the blood upon the carpet was real, the truth beneath it would be harder still to trace, and already the hounds of suspicion had found their scent. It did not take long for the investigators, those blunt instruments of municipal suspicion, to arrive at a conclusion. Lying near the study door was an object so damning in its symbolism that it required no further analysis in the eyes of the local constable. A green hat. It was identical in shade and shape to the one worn by Clara Greywood during our last visit. Though weather-stained and bent at the brim, its origin was unmistakable, and its presence at the scene ignited a storm of speculation. She returned, muttered a footman under his breath. Slipped in through the garden. The old man must have confronted her. By the time Holmes and I emerged from the study, the whispers had curdled into something colder. Accusation, sharpened and ready. Clara, who had vanished days before, was now presumed to have returned under cover of night, and in a fit of madness or rage, attacked her father. Lestrade, who arrived shortly thereafter, seemed content with the theory. She had motive, family disgrace, inheritance complications. We've seen it before, Holmes. But Holmes did not respond. He merely held the hat aloft, studying its underside. No blood, he observed. No rain spatter, and oddly, no scent of powder or soil. He looked at Lestrade with faint amusement. It's a clever plant, he said. Too clever for Miss Greywood, I fear, but quite suited to someone who knew the story of her mother, and wished to reawaken it. While Lestrade busied himself with establishing a timeline of Clara's presumed nocturnal assault, Holmes turned his attention to the study window. It was unlatched, its wooden frame warped by time and the recent storm, though it bore no signs of brute force. Holmes knelt to examine the sill more closely and soon called me over. Observe, he said, pointing with his magnifying glass. A residue, barely perceptible, but unmistakable in nature. I peered down. A pale smear lay across the edge of the interior sill, catching faintly in the light. Wax? I asked. He nodded. Sealing wax, to be precise, the sort used to affix ropes for theatrical curtains or stage props. And here, he gestured to the floor just beneath the sill. See how the dust has been disturbed in a curving pattern? Someone entered through the window not by force but by artifice. A cord fastened to the latch, perhaps even pulled from outside. It was a staged entry, Watson. To imply the intruder came from without. Precisely, and to suggest Miss Greywood climbed through in secret, unnoticed. But the wax tells another tale. It was planted. The real entry occurred from within. Holmes stood, his gaze now fixed on the writing desk. If one wished to shift blame onto a missing girl, what better way than to replicate the symbols most associated with her hat, her heritage, and her silence? The picture, once blurred, was beginning to take shape, and it pointed not toward Clara, but toward a puppet master hiding behind the curtain. Sir Lionel, though conscious once more, refused to speak. His expression, though strained by pain, held a resolute tightness, as though his lips had been sewn shut, not by injury, but by something far older, fear. Holmes requested access to the family safe, and after a pointed glance from Lestrade, the reluctant patriarch gave a faint nod. The key was located beneath a bust of Cicero, an irony not lost on Holmes. Inside, amid legal deeds and the yellowing edges of forgotten correspondence, Holmes drew forth a small envelope, brittle with age and sealed with a faded insignia. He broke the seal carefully. The letter within was brief. The handwriting, though elegant, trembled at its edges, and it bore a name I had not seen before, though Holmes's eyes narrowed the moment he read it aloud. Calhoun. The words that followed were staggering in implication. To destroy you, I must become what you feared I was. The silence you demanded will now speak in fire. Clara shall inherit nothing but ruin as I did. Watch for the sparrow's return. Holmes folded the letter and replaced it in his coat. It is written by a woman long presumed dead, he said softly. Sir Lionel's former mistress, thought to have drowned in France, but this is no ghost's voice. It is a promise, a vengeance long ripened. We stood in silence, the storm outside rising to meet the one now breaking within these walls. The true enemy, it seemed, had worn no green hat, but bore a heart stitched with older wounds, following the discovery of the letter and the cryptic promise of vengeance it contained. Holmes grew uncharacteristically quiet. He spent the better part of that evening pacing before the hearth, brooding over the fire's glow, as if drawing forth some hidden pattern from its flickering shadows. At last, he turned to me with decision etched into every line of his countenance. The brooch, he said, the one left behind by the girl in the green hat. Indeed, Watson, it shall serve as our signal flare in the dark. He penned a letter and dispatched it with a trusted messenger to an editor at the Evening Gazette. The contents were brief but potent. A fabricated notice that the brooch, now purported to have belonged to Lady Emmeline Greywood, had been identified and transferred into Scotland Yard's evidence vault. The notice implied it bore a hidden inscription linking it to the Sparrowhawk Society. This, Holmes explained, will draw her out. You believe Mrs. Calhoun, if indeed she lives, will attempt to reclaim it? I am certain of it, he replied. The brooch is both artifact and admission. For her, it is the loose thread that must be severed before it unravels the entire design. That night, Holmes placed the brooch in a velvet case upon the mantelpiece, lit a single lamp in the sitting room, and took up a volume of Cicero with an ease I found wholly unconvincing. But his eyes did not follow the text. They remained fixed upon the door. It was near the hour of 2 when I stirred from uneasy rest to the sound of the faintest creak along the lower floorboards. A whisper of movement, too careful to be innocent. I rose quietly and found Holmes already alert, seated in his chair with the lamp still burning low. He held one finger to his lips and gestured toward the sitting room. The air had grown colder, and outside the fog coiled thick around Baker Street like a serpent guarding its secrets. Within, all was still, save for a shadow that flitted across the wall. A figure emerged, masked and gloved, their forms slender and deliberate. They moved with the caution of one who had practiced the route before. A slender hand reached toward the mantle, fingers hovering just above the brooch's case. But before they could lift it, Holmes stepped from the gloom. "You are late," he said mildly. "I had expected you an hour ago." The figure whirled, a blade drawn in a flash of silver, but Holmes was faster still. With the deftness of a panther, he seized the intruder's wrist and twisted. The dagger clattered to the floor. "Watson, if you please." I stepped forward and struck a match. The mask was torn away. The woman beneath gasped, not in fear, but in fury. Her features were sharp, her cheeks hollowed by time, but the eyes burned with a hatred undimmed by age. "I should have known," she hissed. "You meddling devil." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I merely offered an invitation, and you were kind enough to accept." Now, fully revealed beneath the gaslight, the woman who stood before us was not a stranger to Holmes. He regarded her with the kind of solemn recognition one reserves for spectres long buried, yet never forgotten. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said softly. "Alive after all." The woman straightened, her mouth a tight, bitter line. "I never asked for a grave," she replied. "They gave it to me nonetheless." Her features, once striking, bore the erosion of years spent in shadow. Cheekbones sharpened by hunger, lips thinned by silence, eyes like embers behind ash. She did not tremble. Rather, there was a strange dignity in her defiance, as though the act of discovery had liberated her. "You vanished from France," Holmes continued, "presumed drowned after your carriage plunged into the Seine, but no body was recovered." "I ensured that," she said. "A body complicates freedom." "Freedom to do what?" "To watch," she replied. "To plan. To wait." I stood stunned as the pieces assembled in my mind. This was the woman whom Sir Lionel had once loved and discarded. The woman who had borne his child in secret, only to be cast aside when that connection became inconvenient. The maid who died. The letter. Clara's perilous inheritance. It all converged upon this pale apparition. "Why return now?" I asked. Her gaze did not shift from Holmes. "Because the past has teeth, and I grew tired of watching it chew my name to bone." Holmes gave a nod, as if acknowledging an adversary rather than a criminal. "You orchestrated every step," he said. "But you forgot one truth. Even shadows leave footprints, if one knows where to look." Holmes motioned to the chair across from the fire, and with the resignation of one who has rehearsed her confession for years, Mrs. Calhoun seated herself. Her voice, when it came, was measured, neither defensive nor pleading. "I raised Clara's maid as my own," she began, "took her from the slums and shaped her in silence. Told her stories, not lies, but truths with edges honed to wound, of betrayal, of lineage, of Sir Lionel's cowardice. She believed them, because they were real." Holmes remained still, his hands folded, listening. "She infiltrated the Greywood household as planned, learned its routines, its vulnerabilities. The brooch was easy, lifted from Clara's dressing table one morning while she was bathing. But the girl..." Her voice wavered for the first time. She grew soft, grew fond of Clara, and then threatened to reveal me. "So, you silenced her," Holmes said, his voice like a blade dulled not by age but by sorrow. Mrs. Calhoun looked up. "I gave her peace. I could no longer contain my revulsion. You murdered a child you claimed to love." "I ended a witness," she said coldly, "as Sir Lionel ended me. The difference is, I remembered her name." A silence fell over the room. broken only by the hiss of the fire. Holmes stood at last. "Vengeance seldom ends with the satisfaction one imagines," he said. "It corrodes the vessel that carries it." She smiled faintly. "And yet, it leaves a mark." The constables arrived moments later. She did not resist, and so ended a performance scripted not in madness, but in memory, a tragedy born of secrets, stitched with betrayal, and crowned by a hat the colour of envy itself. There are few moments I have witnessed in which Holmes's mind, in all its cold lucidity, seemed to cast a weight heavier than any jailer's chain. It was not merely the facts he assembled, nor the logic he wielded like a surgeon's scalpel. It was the quiet, relentless inevitability with which he brought them forth one after another, until denial became not only impossible but absurd. We sat in the parlour once more. Mrs. Calhoun, restrained but unrepentant, stared into the fire as if it alone offered dignity in the face of exposure. Holmes stood before her, the brooch in one hand, the letter in the other. "You planted this on the maid," he began, "to cast suspicion upon Clara." She made no reply. "You trained the girl yourself, raised her in secrecy, positioned her inside Greywood's household, close enough to observe, close enough to act." Still, she held her silence. Holmes stepped closer. The wax on the windowsill, the hat without soil or scent. Falsehoods. You needed Clara to appear guilty not only to her father, but to the law. A criminal record would dissolve her inheritance. Your vengeance would be complete. Her jaw tightened. The brooch, the note, the trap, they all served a single end. Not justice, but ruin. But in pursuing ruin, Mrs. Calhoun, you exposed yourself. Finally, she turned toward him. Her eyes did not plead, they burned. "You speak of exposure," she whispered, "as if I had anything left to hide." Holmes' voice dropped to a murmur. "Only grief, and you've turned that into a blade." It was not the firmness of Holmes's deductions that broke her, nor the weight of the accusations themselves. Rather, it was the unrelenting calm of his gaze, piercing yet devoid of contempt, that stripped away the last of her defences. Mrs. Calhoun lowered her eyes. For a moment, she was still. Then her breath caught, trembled, and escaped her lips with the faintest sound, neither sigh nor sob, but something in between. "They said I drowned," she murmured. "I remember the headline, a paragraph at the bottom of the society page. No name, just a woman, forgotten as easily as I was discarded." Her voice, once laced with iron, now trembled with a nakedness that unsettled me more than her fury had. "I gave him everything," she said. "And when it no longer suited him, I was erased. But I had a child, a second chance. I could not claim her publicly, but I could shape her future, mould her into something sharp enough to wound him." "You made her an instrument," Holmes said quietly. "She was my justice," she replied, "my blade." She looked at Holmes then, not as an adversary, but as the only man in the room capable of seeing what she had become and why. "But she loved them," she whispered. "That was her betrayal." And with that final confession, the flame in her tone guttered. What remained was a woman not shattered, but hollowed. A ghost kept aloft by memory and malice, and now bereft of both. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Calhoun's composure crumbled like a frost-thinned pane. She did not resist as Holmes seated himself once more, his voice as gentle as it was grim. "She was not your servant," he said. "She was your daughter, in all but name." Mrs. Calhoun nodded slowly. "I named her Elise, taught her to speak with grace, to walk with dignity. I told her that we were going to correct the record, that Greywood's legacy would be ash and silence, just as he made mine." "And how did you place her within the household?" "I paid a man to falsify references. The Greywoods were desperate for quiet, competent staff. Elise proved both. Her tone softened when she spoke of the girl, eyes unfocused, lips trembling. She called me aunt, never knowing. I watched from afar. I sent letters. She asked questions, wanted to understand why we hid, why I hated. But she never stopped believing in Clara. That was her weakness. I could not keep the ache from my chest. You bred her for vengeance, I said. And she chose mercy. Mrs. Calhoun smiled, though it bore no warmth. She forgot who she was meant to become. She chose loyalty over legacy. And thus became a threat to your design, Holmes concluded. She became a danger to the story I had written. It was a tale of two inheritances, one of blood, the other of bitterness, and in the end, the former refused to bend to the latter's command. The final threads of the tragedy came together not with drama, but with devastating quiet. She came to me, Mrs. Calhoun confessed. Elise. She had found the letter, understood everything. She begged me to stop, said Clara had done no wrong, said I was breaking what little remained of us both. Her voice broke again. She threatened to confess it all to Sir Lionel, to end the charade. And you acted, Holmes said, not as a question, but as the last link in the chain. Mrs. Calhoun nodded. I had no choice. You strangled her, I said, barely above a whisper. I silenced her, she replied, and left the brooch in her pocket. The girl in the green hat would die as a warning, and Clara would wear the guilt. She said no more. For a long time, no one did. Holmes rose and signalled Lestrade. The inspector, who had been silent in the adjoining room, stepped forward with handcuffs already prepared. Mrs. Calhoun stood on her own. I regret nothing, she said, except that she did not understand. She understood, Holmes said. That's what makes this the greater crime. And with that, she was led away, lesser villainous than a woman undone by the story she could no longer control. It was well past midnight when we returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps flickering weakly in the misted dark, their glow swallowed almost whole by the gathering fog. Holmes removed his overcoat with the absent-mindedness of a man whose thoughts were already several layers deeper than the physical world. I sat across from him, notebook in hand, aware that he would now, in customary fashion, unwind the knot before me. And indeed, after several minutes of silence and a single contemplative puff of his pipe, he began. You recall the feather, Watson, he said. The green one found near the strangled maid. Certainly. It was too pristine. No signs of wear, no trace of soot or debris upon its vein, despite the filthy state of the room in which it was discovered. It had been placed there, deliberately. He leaned forward, his voice dropping in pitch. The feather was not an oversight, it was an invitation. It cried out for recognition. It was the first crack in the mask. Whoever had gone to such pains to conceal their steps would never leave such a vibrant calling card unless it were necessary. It pointed not to a murderer hiding in the shadows, but one willing to manufacture a myth. I saw it now, clear as the fog on the pane. The feather, the hat, the brooch, they were props, each selected with care to dress a stage built from lies. And Holmes had read them all. Holmes removed the brooch from the velvet pouch he had placed it in and held it delicately beneath the lamp's glow. The facets of the emeralds within shimmered like shallow water stirred by wind. This piece, he began, though ornate, was not of recent make. It bore the crest of House Greywood, a falcon in mid-dive above a branch of ash. A symbol once recognised in every drawing room in Belgravia. He turned it over. More curiously, the clasp had been soldered and repaired, twice. The second repair was performed crudely, by a less than skilled hand, and quite recently. Someone used it not merely as jewellery, but as a cipher, an emblem of connection. You deduce the girl who visited us was linked to the Greywoods because of it? I asked. Precisely. She claimed no name. Her hands trembled, but the brooch, left behind with what appeared to be accidental haste, tied her to a noble lineage. That made the rest of her silence suspicious. No servant, Watson, not even one in distress, wears a crest unless she is permitted or wishes to be noticed. His gaze grew sterner. I concluded then that the girl was not only of the household, but intended us to connect her visit to the murder without revealing her face. She was made a ghost, conjured to haunt, not to speak. And in that haunting, Mrs. Calhoun had almost succeeded. Almost. But for a mind that refused to accept even the softest feather as chance. From the lowest drawer of his desk, Holmes produced the ledger, still dusty, its pages still redolent of mildew and age. He laid it upon the table and opened it to the page where 3 dates were circled in faded ink. These were not mere accounting marks, he said. They corresponded with 3 events. The death of Lady Emmeline Greywood, the presumed drowning of Mrs. Calhoun, and the year Elise entered the Greywood household under an assumed name. He turned another page. Scrawled along the margins were cryptic references, initials, symbols, and most prominently, a recurring motif, the image of a sparrowhawk. The Sparrowhawk Society, Holmes explained, was once a clandestine assembly of aristocratic gamblers, financiers, and those with a taste for ruin disguised as sport. They thrived under anonymity, and they rewarded silence. And Lady Emmeline? I asked. She was the leak, he replied. A woman of conscience born too late. She exposed the society's inner circle in a letter to a reformist journal, but the scandal was buried swiftly and without noise. Her own family suppressed the truth. She died by her own hand, weeks later. A pause passed between us, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Mrs. Calhoun knew this. She knew the shame and silence of that family would endure anything to protect its veneer. And so she constructed a mirror, another woman in green, another act of self-sacrifice, another death within the house. But the ledger, Holmes tapped it lightly. It was never meant to be found. It was her confession, hidden in plain sight. The society was gone, but its ghosts had authored this tragedy. And Holmes, ever the exorcist of lies, had drawn their names from ink and silence alike. With the confession of Mrs. Calhoun and the ledger laid bare, Clara Greywood's name was formally cleared. She emerged from seclusion, pale, silent, and burdened by a grief that no verdict could erase. Holmes declined the ceremony that followed. I deal in truth, he said, not apologies. But for me, it was Clara's quiet eyes that lingered most in my thoughts. She had inherited not merely the ashes of nobility, but the ruinous weight of secrets she had never been allowed to understand. Sir Lionel, weakened and broken by the assault and the revelations that followed, withdrew from public life entirely. His once proud name faded from the papers, and the Greywood estate was placed under trusteeship. Thus, the house that once whispered of scandal and silence fell fully into the grasp of memory, where so many noble names now sleep, unwept, unspoken, unloved. I could not help but feel that Clara had been freed not by justice, but by fire. The story was not hers to write, only to survive. A few days later, as we sat again by the hearth at Baker Street, Inspector Lestrade paid us a visit. He was never one to linger in praise, and even less inclined to speak in sentiment. But there was a certain unease in his gait as he entered. Holmes offered him tea without ceremony. Lestrade accepted, then cleared his throat. "That man we arrested," he muttered. "The thief with the necklace. He's been released." "Of course," Holmes replied without looking up from his paper. He never fit the pattern. Lestrade hesitated, then added, "We questioned him again. Turns out he lifted the necklace from the maid's satchel after her death. Didn't kill her, just saw an opportunity." He fell quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You were right, Holmes. The whole thing. I never would have seen it." Holmes finally looked up, his eyes neither gloating nor sharp. "It was never about seeing, Lestrade," he said. "It was about listening to what wasn't said." Lestrade rose, gave a stiff nod, and left as quietly as he had come. When the door closed, Holmes returned to his paper as though nothing had occurred. But I thought, just for a moment, that I saw a trace of weariness pass across his face. The case was closed, yet I found no solace in the quiet of our rooms. The gas lamps sputtered softly in the corners of the study, their light weaving faint shadows upon the walls as I sat beside the hearth. The fire flickered brightly, the logs crackling with a warmth that was in stark contrast to the chill that had settled in my chest. Holmes sat opposite me, his figure tall and lean, almost shadow-like in the dim light. His pipe, unlit, rested between his fingers, and I noticed his gaze, fixed intently on the glowing embers, seemed distant, far beyond the room and the events we had just concluded. It was a rare thing for Holmes to show any sign of fatigue or emotional disturbance, yet on this evening there was something in his posture that suggested weariness, something beneath the sharpness of his eyes that held the weight of the case, long after it had been resolved. I leaned back in my chair, watching him in silence. The investigation had concluded, the villain unmasked, and the rightful heir freed. Yet something in me felt unsettled, as though the very conclusion I had longed for now left an emptiness. The answer was clear, yet the question lingered in the air, like smoke from the fire that would not dissipate. Holmes finally stirred, as if sensing my thoughts, and with a slight exhalation, he began to speak, though not as if addressing me directly. "There is no hatred more potent," Holmes began, his voice low and steady, "than that masked as devotion." I looked at him, his words striking a chord deep within me. He continued, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Mrs. Calhoun's actions, and indeed the tragic course of this entire affair, stemmed from a perverse form of love, a devotion to a man who had long since discarded her. She raised the child of another woman as her own, but not for affection, Watson. She raised her as a weapon. Love, when twisted by pride and betrayal, becomes a force more destructive than any rage." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. The shadow of the Sparrowhawk Society, long dead yet never forgotten, loomed over this family. It was not only a legacy of wealth and scandal, it was the poison that infected everything it touched. And Mrs. Calhoun, driven by her love for the man who had betrayed her, sought revenge on the Greywoods in the only way she could, by using Clara's life to destroy the Greywood name. I could see the bitterness in his expression, a sentiment rarely revealed. She created a tragedy that would unravel not only her former lover's life, but that of his daughter. Her obsession with vengeance turned into something much darker, a generational curse. There was a deep sorrow in Holmes's tone, the kind that spoke of long, unresolved grief, and I knew that despite his brilliance, there were some human failings that he could not wholly comprehend or dismiss. I felt a weight settle in my chest as Holmes finished his reflection. The case, though solved, left a lingering question in my mind, one I could not shake. Justice had been delivered, yes, but at what cost? Clara Greywood, though exonerated, had been drawn into a world of lies, deception, and loss. The truth had been uncovered, but not without devastating consequences. "Holmes," I asked, unable to hold back the question that had gnawed at me since the conclusion, Was true justice served in the end? Or did we simply bring about a clever conclusion to a web of deceit? Holmes turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. Justice, Watson, is not always as clear-cut as we would like. It is an instrument, yes, but one that must be tempered with wisdom, understanding, and, occasionally, mercy. It is a question for the mind, not the law. His words, as ever, were a source of both clarity and mystery, leaving me to wrestle with the deeper implications of the case. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he regarded me, as though gauging the depth of my contemplation. Watson, the law is a rigid instrument, bound by the letter of its rules, he said, his voice calm but firm. But there are times, as this case has shown, when the law must borrow the eyes of the mind. It must see beyond the facts, beyond the surface, to uncover what lies hidden beneath. Justice, in its truest form, is not about strict adherence to the rules, but about understanding the nature of the crime, the motivations of those involved, and the consequences of their actions. I nodded slowly, appreciating the clarity with which he spoke. His mind, ever sharp, had not only solved the case, but had also shed light on the complexities of human nature, the very core of the mystery. The law may convict, Holmes continued, but it is the mind that seeks the truth. And with those words, our conversation fell into a contemplative silence, each of us reflecting on the case that had occupied our minds for so long, and the lessons it had imparted. As I sat opposite Holmes, the fire crackling softly between us, a quiet stillness hung in the air. He looked thoughtfully into the flames, his brow furrowed in the manner I had come to recognize when his mind was still working through a matter. At last he spoke, his voice steady, yet tinged with the weariness that came with untangling the webs of human deception. The human heart, he mused, is often driven by a singular emotion, love. But when that love is betrayed, it turns to bitterness, and in the end, it consumes the very person who wields it. Mrs. Calhoun's obsession, her drive for vengeance, became the very thing that destroyed her, much like the Greywood family itself. They were all bound by secrets, some more deadly than others. His words lingered in the air, a quiet warning about the dangers of unresolved passions. "But tell me, Watson," he continued, looking up with that familiar gleam in his eye, "what do you think was Mrs. Calhoun's greatest mistake? Was it her desire for revenge, or her failure to understand that, in the end, all secrets come to light?" I thought for a moment, contemplating the tragedy that had unfolded before us. As Holmes returned to his quiet reflection, I turned to you, the listener, curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the fatal flaw in Mrs. Calhoun's plan? Was it revenge itself, or something deeper? If you found this case intriguing, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more mysteries, and be sure to share this story with those who enjoy a good puzzle. After all, there is always more to uncover. The mystery has concluded, for now.